Welcome everyone. We're going to wait just 2 more minutes in case anyone is stuck in Zoom traffic in getting here today. Once the numbers of participants go up a little bit more, we will begin. So give us 1 more minute or two as we wait. Okay, great. Welcome everyone. My name is Jordanna Gessler. I am the Vice President of Education and Exhibits at Holocaust Museum LA. Thank you so much for joining our monthly series, Inside the Acid-Free Box, taking a deep look into our archival collection. I'm joined here with my colleague. I will let her introduce herself. She is calling in from inside our locked, secure archive. Christie.
Hi, obviously I'm Christie. Probably don't need to introduce myself, but thanks, Jordanna. I'm the collections manager at the museum, and yes, I am in the archive. You can see behind me here.
Wonderful. Thank you everyone for joining us. Since the pandemic, we've been working really hard in creating programs that are educational and poignant and also digital and virtual. So please feel free to let us know what you think. Also, if you have a question while we're giving this presentation today, don't forget to drop it in the Q&A box. We will have time for questions and answers at the end. Today, we will be discussing Nazi hate symbols and propaganda. We've been seeing a lot of Nazi rhetoric and symbols increasingly being used in schools, public protests, even by figures in society or government. And we believe that students and visitors armed with accurate historical understanding of these symbols are better prepared to recognize and speak out against such hate rhetoric. So hopefully at the end of this presentation, you feel more prepared to do so. This photo that we're looking at here on the screen is actually of a Nazi rally. And you can see at least two of the symbols we'll be talking about. One of them is the swastika, maybe the most infamous of all of the Nazi symbols, and the other is the Heil Hitler. The Nazis held many, many, many large rallies, and these were designated. There was a lot of specific rally grounds that were designated to hold these large rallies, like for the one in Nuremberg, which is quite well known. And it was really important for the Nazis to strengthen the bond between Hitler and the German people. And we'll dive a little bit more into this cult of personality that was perpetuated around Hitler. But here you can see this image, just thousands of people coming grouped together to feel as if they were one under their leader. So before we start talking specifically about the Nazi movement, just for those of you who are joining us for the first time for Inside the Acid-Free Box, I'll let Christie tell us a little bit more about our incredibly vast and large collection of primary source artifacts. As many of you know, when Holocaust Museum LA was founded in 1961, it was founded by a group of survivors who believed that there should be a space to both commemorate their loved ones and educate future generations, but also hold these precious material objects that had weathered the Holocaust and can continue sharing the stories of those who are unable to share their stories. So Christie, tell us a little bit about this rich collection that we have at the museum.
Yeah, so we have a little over 20,000 artifacts and documents within the museum's collection, and it includes things like photographs, documents, three-dimensional objects, survivor testimony, textiles, and other family heirlooms. And many of the collections relate to a particular family or a particular person and have been donated by a family. So some of the artifacts that we're going to be discussing today span several of the collections within the museum's overall collection. In particular, some of those that explore different Nazi propaganda and other related materials. And then many of the artifacts that we're going to be talking about today can actually be found on display in the museum's second gallery, which is what we're looking at in the image right here.
And this is the gallery, The Rise of Nazism, Terror and Deception. So this gallery is primarily dedicated to the years between 1933, a little bit prior, through 1939, up until the outbreak of World War II, and really look at the way in which the Nazi government systematically enacted laws and legislation and propaganda that highlighted their ideology, disseminated their information, and really began to sway the beliefs of the population. Mostly through propaganda and targeted anti-Semitic and racist notions. And so before we talk specifically about the Nazis, I do want to talk a little bit about the term anti-Semitism. So the term anti-Semitism, the word itself, actually only dates back to the 19th century, but hatred of Jewish people goes back thousands of years. Throughout history, Jews have been blamed for social and political problems. Perhaps the most well-known one is that Jewish people are collectively held responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus. This, of course, is untrue. Jews were not responsible for that. Jews for many, many years were kind of forced to be on the fringe of society until the Enlightenment period, specifically in Europe. That brought waves of reform and emancipation across the 18th and 19th centuries. However, Jews continue to face anti-Semitic persecution. We have a few images here on the screen. One of them is that of a very famous statue of Moses. It was done by Michelangelo, an incredibly famous artist. You might notice on this statue of Moses that there's actually horns coming out of his head. This is due to a mistranslation from when Michelangelo was creating the statue. A mistranslation from beams of light radiating from Moses's head was mistranslated into the word for horns. Michelangelo, being a very noteworthy artist, created the statue, and thus a very well-known anti-Semitic trope was born, in which people believe that Jewish people have horns. So of course you can see that some of these falsehoods date way back into history. And we also have two images on the right. One is of a man with a yellow circle on his cloak. The other is with a man with a yellow hat. These are symbols of shame. These were symbols that Jews were forced to wear throughout different time periods, throughout different countries, to publicly identify them as other. Many of us are well aware of yellow stars during the Holocaust that Nazis forced Jewish people to wear. They did not come up with this. This was not something new. Throughout history, there are moments and times where Jews were forced to wear these badges of shame. Also, additionally, so we're looking at some, images from hundreds of years ago, but there's a photograph, a black and white photograph on the screen of a man named Dreyfus. And back in 1894, he was imprisoned for treason in France, but was actually innocent and was a victim of anti-Semitism. And this goes to the stab in the back myth, which the Nazis borrowed and reintroduced under Nazi Germany. And so just as we're talking today, I think it's important to consider that anti-Semitism was not created by the Nazis. It also did not end with the Nazis. It was not created during the Holocaust. It did not end with the Holocaust. And they just built on preconceived notions of othering and discrimination. And so I know that Christie has some items that she's going to share with us. So I'm going to stop the screen share so we can see her better.
Yeah, so going further on what you were discussing, Jordanna, about the fact that the Nazis didn't invent anti-Semitism, or really the hat or the identification marks that we saw in some of the pictures that you were showing on the slide before. So this is an example of that. So we actually have a set of these dolls on display in the first gallery of the museum, and they were made by Holocaust survivor Trudy Strobel. And essentially, as a young child, Trudy had this beloved doll that was her prized possession, and it was torn away from her by Nazi guards when she was being deported to the camps. And years later, this traumatic experience really stuck with her, and she decided to recreate the doll that she had had as a child, and decided to dress it in with a yellow star, which is what the Nazis forced the Jews to wear at the time. And so upon delving a little bit deeper into this history, she discovered that these badges were not, in fact, invented by the Nazis, as we mentioned before, but they had a long history of being used to humiliate and single out Jews in society. And so this particular doll is one of the set that we have on display. And you can see here, so it depicts a man from the 12th to 17th century Europe. And the two symbols that we kind of touched on before was the yellow circle and also the yellow hat. So both of those were symbols that were used to identify him as Jewish and that Jews were forced to wear at that time.
So moving more now into Nazi anti-Semitism, hate speech, and propaganda. Nazi ideology transformed the notion of anti-Semitism from a religious-based hatred to a racially-based one. So previous to the Nazis coming to power and really previous to the 19th century, anti-Semitism and hatred of Jews was based, as I said earlier, of their religion, the belief that they had murdered Jesus, the belief that they were other. And many people who hated Jews believed that if they could convert out of Judaism, then they would no longer need to be victims of hatred. However, the Nazis transformed that and instead propagated that Jewish people were actually different, not because of their religion, but because of their blood. The Nazis believed that there was a hierarchy of races in the world, and their race, the Aryan race, was the very top of this hierarchy, and the Jews were the very bottom, and all in between there are a number of different categories of people that would fall in. And the Nazis also believed that nobody could convert out of their race, that all of this was very much tied to blood and the purity of blood. These are all, of course, social constructions, and a lot of it is based on pseudoscience. So you can actually see a picture of a man measuring a woman's face. The Nazis had many scientists who dabbled in pseudoscience, so non-factual based science that believed that different people in different groups could be identified based on the size of their nose, the size of their ears, the color of their eyes, the color of their hair. This, of course, as we know today, is not true. Hitler and the Nazis also held these racial principles as one of the most important components of their ideology and beliefs. And furthermore, they took this ideology and created laws based on it. So many of the laws in Nazi Germany were based on racial preconceived notions that were in fact untrue. You can also see here an image of Hitler speaking and also an image of a radio. And what I always think is very interesting about Nazi propaganda is that the Nazis really wanted to disseminate their ideology throughout the entire country. And at the time in the 1930s, of course, there were no flat screen TVs and Netflix. And so most people would use radios to hear shows, to hear music, to hear news reports, and radios were a bit expensive at the time. And so the Nazis actually created an inexpensive radio called the People's Radio, the Folks Radio. That's an image of it in the lower corner of the screen. And they gave this radio out for free to any German person who was not Jewish. Jews were forbidden from having radios, had to turn their radios in if they owned one. And the Nazis ensured that every single Aryan person owned one of these radios. They gave them for free. And what did this do? This one ensured, some great excitement around a government giving out free technology. At the same time, it ensured that the Nazis could reach every single household in Germany with their propaganda, with their different radio shows, with different, programs that would spew this falseness, this ideology that they had perpetuated. And so really understanding that anti-Semitism and hate rhetoric was which was a part of this much larger Nazi propaganda machine that was very strategic in the way that it got to and reached different aspects of society. And it's, just as we're about to go look at some artifacts, I think I mentioned, and I want to make it clear that Nazi ideology borrowed many pre-existing concepts involving race, mankind, blood purity, power, and natural order. Oftentimes these concepts were unrelated. Sometimes they were conflicting. The important part is that they repeated it so often and made it so widely available that people started to believe them. And Hitler was a very public figure. He was depicted in Nazi propaganda as both someone who was accessible and relatable. He was somebody who worked for the people, would oftentimes be depicted as hiking or, playing with dogs or with children, or working the earth. But he was also depicted as somebody who was unattainable and divine. We'll talk about the cult of personality in a little bit. But just these are some ideas I want you to be percolating a little bit in your heads. And here I'm going to stop my share so Christie can show us an artifact that she has with her.
Yeah, so this is the artifact of what we were looking at on the screen just a moment ago. So this is actually a racial science poster that was produced by the Nazis. And so you can see it shows essentially two columns of children. One side is what the Jewish youth supposedly look like, and then the other side is the German youth. And at the bottom in German, which is a little hard to see, but it's subtitled "From the Face Speaks the Soul of the Race." So this is essentially a chart that was used, a teaching chart that came as an accompaniment with a textbook about race and biology. And it was directed at elementary school children and was designed, as Jordanna mentioned before, with the thought in mind that you could supposedly identify those that the Nazis considered not Aryan by their physical features.
And Nazi propagandists branded Jewish people as a biological threat to Germany and German people, and to the Aryan race. There was government-sponsored racist anti-Semitic propaganda. As we said, it was extensively disseminated. It would denounce Jews as alien, parasites, vermin, diseased. This hate rhetoric impacted society enormously, creating an environment in which persecution and violence against Jews was acceptable. Jews were viewed as less than human, less worthy of respect or protection, and ultimately less worthy of life. And here I'll go back to the PowerPoint. Racists define national ethnic identity through the myth of this pure inherited blood that the Nazis believed. And they believed that racism was an integral part of Hitler and the Nazi Party's doctrine. Hitler was obsessed with the concept of race and racial struggle, and he regarded human history as one of biologically determined fight between races, and political movements such as communism or internationalism were not only dangerous, but were caused by Jews and were part of this racial struggle between people. Again, we now know, and we've known for a while, that racism is a social construct. There is nothing different between one person's blood or another's. But this is a lot of what we hear today oftentimes is related very much to Nazi propaganda. And so here we have some Nazi propaganda. I said earlier that they used a lot of old tropes. And so here we have some examples. On the right side of the screen is an issue of Der Stürmer from 1934. This was a Nazi propaganda newspaper created by an anti-Semitic man named Julius Streicher, who was actually later found guilty of crimes against humanity at the Nuremberg trials following the end of the Holocaust. In fact, most of the evidence against Streicher came from his speeches and articles in this newspaper, and he was held responsible for crimes against humanity because of this hate rhetoric. And you can also see this newspaper was actually in the black and white photograph at the bottom of the screen. This newspaper would be plastered on public billboards throughout Germany, where people, the public, could come and see, and always under this big slogan, "The Jews are our misfortune." And this was a routine newspaper that would be published. One thing that I think is particularly interesting about this one specific newspaper is that this cover has an image depicting Jews extracting blood from Christian children for use in a religious ritual. And this is actually called a blood libel. Again, the Nazis did not invent blood libels. The belief that Jews needed the blood of Christian babies for religious rituals actually extends back to the Middle Ages, originating in the United Kingdom, I believe in around the 14th century. So this was definitely an old concept, an old preconceived concept that grew out of just not understanding how Jewish rituals were different from Christian ones. And I think it's really important for us to understand that the Nazis are playing on old tropes, old fears that had been perpetuated in society for hundreds of years, and are playing with it and adding it to their specific racial anti-Semitism. The blood libel actually spread throughout the Christian world in the Middle Ages, and oftentimes throughout history, when a Christian child went missing in a town, it was not uncommon for local Jews to be blamed for this. And this newspaper is really, I think, important in understanding that even though the Nazis based their anti-Semitism in racial theory, as we just talked about, they did capitalize on preconceived notions and religious hatred of Jews. And I think this newspaper is an example of just that. I know, Christie, you have some images to show us. So what do you have with you in the archive?
Yeah, so some more of the items that we were just seeing on screen just a moment ago. So this is another example of Nazi propaganda. So this was actually a postcard that was issued for a traveling exhibit called The Eternal Jew. And the exhibition was shown in many German cities, so Munich, Berlin, Vienna. This particular postcard is for the exhibition in Vienna. And it was attended by over 400,000 people. And the exhibit essentially depicted stereotypical anti-Semitic images of Jews and attempted to illustrate the charge that there was a Jewish world conspiracy and a link between Judaism and communism. And so in this postcard, we can actually see it depicts a grotesquely stereotypical European Jewish man with a large nose and a beard, and he's holding, you might be able to see in his hand there, he's holding gold coins, which is, really kind of going back to the anti-Semitic trope that Jews were money hungry. Then there's a small map on the other side, which is depicting the Soviet Union with a hammer and sickle, and that's intended to really represent the supposed Soviet Jewish conspiracy. And then
what I think is so interesting about that image is it really goes to show you how Nazi propaganda was oftentimes at odds with itself. So that image is meant to, identify Jews as capitalists, money hungry. He's holding money, he's a capitalist. But at the same time, he's holding the Soviet Union, which was a communist country. So how is it that a Jewish person can both be capitalist and communist? I mean, I guess that is something that really only the Nazis could think of. And this is just such an example of the way in which they were sort of taking every misconception and every anti-Semitic notion of a Jewish person, combining it into one, and then presenting it to the public, hoping that different pieces of it would resonate with different groups. So this image would resonate with people who were fearful of communists. It would also resonate with people who were communists and fearful of capitalists. It would also resonate with people who associated Jews with big, hooked, kind of ugly, disheveled noses and sort of a kind of disheveled appearance as being dirty, which I think leads us to the other artifact you have with you.
Yeah, so this is another example of Nazi propaganda. This one has Russian text on it, and but you can essentially tell without even understanding what the text says, what it's trying to get at. So it's, comparing Jews to rats. The text specifically translates to, the Jews are like rats, they devour the wealth of your people. And this likening of Jews to rats was commonly seen in Nazi propaganda, and aligning with that common misconception of Jews being dirty and carrying disease that Jordanna mentioned before.
And I mean, this notion actually even goes back to the Black Plague, when Jews were blamed for unleashing the Black Plague. In fact, there's extensive historical documentation that in 1892 in New York City, during a typhus epidemic, Jewish immigrants were blamed for unleashing typhus and were even sent to quarantine islands. So again, the Nazis did not create this association. They oftentimes would associate Jews with rats, dirty, disease, and spread extreme propaganda saying that Jews were responsible from anything from typhus to even cancer or syphilis. Again, we now know that these things are untrue, but at that time, the Nazis were so strong in their propaganda images, and just the repetition of this information led to many people believing it. And again, because they didn't invent it, the fact that there were other moments in history where people blamed Jews for diseases definitely helped the Nazis in the sense that they didn't need to recreate many of these notions and ideas. Oops. So now we're going to look at the indoctrination of the youth. The Nazis specifically targeted German youth as an audience for propaganda. Membership to the Hitler Youth was mandatory as of 1939. So this means as of 1939, before World War II broke, it was a mandate that all German children who were not Jewish must belong to the Hitler Youth. There was also a young girls one, so one for young boys and one for young girls. And oftentimes kids were sent to camps and to spaces where they were indoctrinated. They were oftentimes compelled to even turn in their parents if they heard their parents talking perhaps negatively about the Nazi Party or Hitler. Really this propaganda belief that they were part of a community that was important. And education served as a means of indoctrinating students with Nazi Party beliefs. Slowly through the 1930s, the Nazis removed Jewish children from schools and then introduced curriculum that supported Nazi propaganda and ideology. education material at this time glorified the Nazi racial idea of the Aryan race. Again, of course, we know that this is not a real thing, but this was part of their propaganda. And oftentimes they would label Jews and other races as subhuman and a threat to the Germans, who they refer to themselves as the master race. And you can see some images here. So one is a propaganda photo for the youth, the Hitler youth, where you see this young man sort of looking, gazing in the same direction as Hitler, that children and Hitler's cares the most about the future of the youth and knows what's best for them in their vision. You have an image that is actually the other two images are both from books that were designed to be taught in schools. So one of the books was The Poisonous Mushroom, which tells the story of how there are many different mushrooms, but some of them are poisonous, and relates poisonous mushrooms to Jewish people who could then poison society. And you see a little boy at the blackboard with a stick, and he's pointing to a nose, and he's talking about how the Jewish nose looks like a 6. And you can also see that all of the kids in the classroom were blonde. Of course, it is not true that all German kids were blonde. This is, again, part of Nazi propaganda. The other image is from a children's book, Trust No Fox in the Garden, or A Jew on His Oath. And you can see these are kids in the Hitler Youth, and you can see they have little uniforms, and actually part of their uniforms was a belt buckle. And on their belt buckles, there would be the phrase blood and honor, which was the motto of the Hitler Youth. And this was blood and honor. This was their motto. And this slogan is a fundamental idea of Nazi policy, just sort of this notion that they are part of a group that connects them by blood, and they have this honor. It is also a similar concept to the phrase blood and soil, which was a Nazi rallying cry meant to evoke the notion of a racially pure Aryan people, as well as their mystical right to their land. This concept was foundational to Nazi ideology, especially directly to rural populations. And it held that farmers were cultural heroes with strong racial stock. It was used as a tool not only to justify land seizures in Eastern Europe, but also to reinforce anti-Semitic tropes of Jewish capitalism. The official policy furthered the propaganda that the decline of the German rural class was because of German Jews, who were often depicted as greedy bankers, as we talked about. In the US, some right-wing nationalists use the slogan blood and soil, and they conflate this oftentimes with white blood, European identity, and American soil. In fact, Blood and Honor is the name of an international skinhead group currently. And again, this just, when you hear phrases like blood and soil or blood and honor, either in society around you or reading it in a book, understanding that this is directly from Nazi rhetoric. And this goes back directly to the Nazis' belief in racial superiority and having Nordic white people at the top of that hierarchy. There was recently a remark about how Hitler was right about one thing. He said that whoever has the youth has the future. And of course, this is an incredibly problematic remark, because Hitler was not right about this at all. And when he referenced the youth and referenced the future, it was very much one of indoctrination, of propaganda, of hatred, of spewing hatred, of ensuring that children would hate one another. Babies are not born hating. It is something that is taught, and that is part of what Nazi education was. And I will stop the share, Christie, because I know you have some artifacts related to this.
Yeah, so some of the images that Jordanna was talking about. So we have a copy of the book, which is the Trust No Fox in a Green Meadow and No Jew upon His Oath. So this is the book. So essentially, the book was one of a number of anti-Semitic children's books that were published at the time. And it was actually published by Julius Streicher's Sturmer Publishing House, which is what Jordanna mentioned before, the publisher of the Der Stürmer newspaper. So these books were used in schools to teach children. This particular book really doesn't have an active plot, but it's heavily reliant on the illustrations, and it essentially is intended to contrast the stereotypical idea of an Aryan German versus that of the stereotypical depiction of a Jew that we have discussed earlier. So you can see that really playing out in this particular image. And this is one that is on display in our second gallery as well. So you can see, you don't need to understand the text. You can see the depiction in the image.
and very much this heroic farmer whose life is made more difficult by the Jewish capitalistic banker. I mean, this is what was being taught to children in classrooms. So then additionally, we have the cult of personality. So through a carefully orchestrated public image, the Nazi Party facilitated a rapid rise to the position of political power and deliberately cultivated the cult of Hitler as a mass phenomenon. Controlled public appearances, speeches delivered to mass rallies, parades, radio messages, visual materials. There was a tremendous number of paintings, posters, busts, displayed everywhere, from people's homes to schools to classrooms to courthouses to offices, always displaying Hitler as a soldier at the ready, a father figure, and also some messianic leader brought to be the savior of the German nation. And you can see many different examples here. Hitler's cult of personality was actually known as the Führer cult. It was a symbol within its own context because his image was so widely published. He himself became a symbol of the embodiment of the Nazi ideology. The Nazi regime used state-controlled mass media and propaganda to cultivate a larger-than-life public image of their leader through unquestioning flattery and praise. And really, what are the dangers when you cannot question your government or cannot question your leader? And everything about it must be praise and not constructive criticism. So Hitler, as his title, the Führer, which means leader, in his role, he had absolute authority. And you can really see a lot of different images here depicting Hitler as this father figure, depicting him as the savior on a horse and truly a knight in armor holding the swastika flag. You can see him with crowds of people giving the Heil Hitler salute, just with the word "ja," yes. Also, you could see Hitler in the trenches of World War I, fighting and protecting German sovereignty. And again, propaganda oftentimes depicted him in different and conflicting ways to resonate with a diverse population. So depicting him as the farmer for rural communities, or as the genius military man for the army, as the savior of women and children. Constantly, all of this different imagery was really to build up this cult of personality surrounding Hitler. And what do you have to show us, Christie?
So again, I have some of the artifacts from the images. So yeah, it's really, it's interesting because it's definitely reflected in the materials that we have in terms of the things, the Nazi related materials that we have in the collection. You can really get a sense of how much of these things existed that had Hitler depicted in such a multitude of ways. So it's really interesting to see the wide variety. So this is that postcard that was showing on the screen just a moment ago. So it's an illustration, and you can see that it's actually, Hitler as the brave soldier fighting in World War I, that Jordanna mentioned before as one of the common ways that he was depicted. We see, Hitler as the lover of children, with all of his adoring children all around him. And then often a lot as well, there's a lot of images of, Hitler doing the Heil Hitler salute, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but, as a powerful military leader. And then, as well, with respect to what Jordanna mentioned before, the public speeches that he gave a lot. So, as a strong public figure that was going to essentially lead the country and be Germany's savior. So we see that wide variety of different depictions of him in the artifacts that we have in the collection.
And oftentimes, so Hitler was very aware of these public speeches, and he would record himself and then watch the recordings, and then specifically control his body movement, control which words he punctuated. Everything was orchestrated, everything was designed, nothing was spontaneous. And even Hitler's memoir, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, was given to every single couple in Germany that got married as a wedding gift from the state. So again, just this constant devotion that was cultivated around Hitler ensuring that every household had a painting of Hitler, had Mein Kampf, and just this real obsession that was created around him as a person, as a figure. And that takes us to the Heil Hitler, which this was part of his cult of personality. The creation of a loyal and adoring German public with this hand motion and saying Heil Hitler, Hail Hitler, the Hitler salute, the right arm fully thrust forward, the palm facing downward. And this actually was a legal obligation in Germany to say hello to people as a greeting. So somebody walking into a grocery store or walking into the office or walking into their classroom, this was a motion that they must do. This was a greeting that they must do to say hello to someone else, a fellow German person. However, on the flip side of that, German Jews were not permitted to do the Heil Hitler salute. And so if a Jewish person walked in to a grocery store and was greeted with the Heil Hitler, they were forbidden from doing it back and immediately marked them as other. So everybody in that public space would then know this person is not part of the Aryan race. This person must be Jewish. And anyone who refused to do the Heil Hitler salute, so oftentimes many members of the Jehovah's Witnesses faith would not do it. They would be arrested and deported to concentration camps. The first concentration camp was established in 1933, a few months after Hitler came to power. And this was really part of the terror and fear in the society that the Nazis cultivated. Hitler also very much, he talked about the Third Reich, that this was an empire that had this mystical connection to history. And Hitler created a biological association between Roman glory and German aims. And so by linking their ancestry with the mighty Greek and Roman empires, Hitler furthered this racial propaganda. He wanted the image of Germany to be directly linked with ancient Greece and Rome in order to solidify and prove Germany's greatness. And many believe that this greeting, the Heil Hitler, came from the Hail Caesar directly. So of course, this gesture being compulsory, that people had to do it, the people who were forbidden from doing it were left out of the community. And those who refused to greet others with Heil Hitler were arrested for committing a crime. Even students would be expelled from school for doing this. And because specific groups were considered inferior, such as German Jews, this is really creating an othering society by taking one group of people and marginalizing them to the side, making them feel badly about themselves, othering them. Today people would sometimes do Heil Hitler. It is definitely a symbol of hatred. And goes back to the Nazi Party. In fact, the number 88 is a white supremacist numerical code for Heil Hitler, as H is the 8th letter of the alphabet. And this is a very common white supremacist symbol.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the images and things that we have, to me, anyway, you see these huge crowds similar to the picture that you showed at the very beginning of the presentation. So, and they're all, saluting Hitler. So it was really this, sign of their loyalty, and really speaks to how powerful and big the cult around Hitler was, that people were just absolutely devoted and it's stunning to see such a huge crowd of people all saluting him, essentially, which is similar to what the photo that you just showed on the screen a moment ago. But you can see it's just, so many people all, showing their loyalty. And then I have another one on a postcard as well, which in this one you can actually see Hitler and Goring depicted on the balcony, and all of the people below doing the Heil Hitler. So it's a really interesting double-edged sword, like Jordanna mentioned, in a way, because while it was really about fostering that strong national community and bringing people together and showing your loyalty to Hitler, it was simultaneously about excluding the people that the Nazis didn't feel were part of that German community, and people that they felt were inferior, and really isolating them and singling them out as the other.
The next symbol we're going to talk about is maybe the most well-known and most infamous, and that is the swastika. So this is actually from a Sanskrit word, and it means good fortune originally, well-being. And for over 5,000 years, the swastika was a symbol that was actually sacred and remains sacred in Hinduism, Buddhism, and other religions. After Hitler appropriated the symbol to be the cornerstone of the Nazi flag and the Nazi party, its meaning was perverted to represent and promote hate, racism, and anti-Semitism. In 1920, Hitler designed a flag for the Nazi Party by combining the colors of the German imperial flag, red, black, and white, and the symbol of the swastika, making it not only the most recognizable icon of Nazi propaganda, but also a forceful symbol intended to elicit pride for Aryan identity and strike terror in Jews and other deemed by Nazis to be enemies of the state. And I think this is another example of how the Nazis did not create many of these symbols or propaganda, but they sort of just expanded on it and really appropriated the symbol that for many religions remained a symbol of fortune and well-being. And really, for the Nazis to appropriate this symbol really desecrated it in a way for those communities. I think it's also important to note that, again, the Nazis were trying to draw some sort of mystical connection between the Aryan race and previous powers, previous empires. So like the Heil Hitler was a call to Roman history, this was also a callback showing that the Nazis had somehow existed for 5,000 years and had this long connection. Here we have an example of a swastika with French on it. We had Nazi propaganda earlier with Russian. The Nazis were not just creating propaganda in German. They would create propaganda in whatever languages for the communities they were targeting. They would sometimes create propaganda in English, knowing that international press would then show it and more people would be able to read it and understand it. This was all part of their ideology and their desire to spread their message. So, and again, the swastika would be everywhere. Symbols of it would be on buildings. It would be on flags. In 1935, with the Nuremberg laws, one of the laws was that German Jews were no longer permitted to fly the national flag. And at the same time, it was compulsory for other Germans, for non-Jewish Germans, to fly the national flag, of course, the national flag being the swastika. So what did this do? This ensured that every single building, except for Jewish homes, had the swastika outside of it. Again, creating that separation in society, belittling a group of people, but ultimately allowing people to identify where Jewish people lived. So when violence would break out, like it did in Kristallnacht in 1938, it ensured that the community knew exactly which homes and businesses belonged to Jewish people. And I know, Christie, you have many examples in our archive. We can't even go through all the examples of swastikas that we have, but what do you have to show us there?
Yeah, so as you said, we have many different items that have swastikas included on them. It seems like the Nazis put it on almost everything. So it was very common. You would see it everywhere. We have things like flags and articles of clothing, badges, all of that kind of stuff, which you would expect. We also have it on things that you might not necessarily expect. So we have this matchbook cover, which you can see has the swastika and the eagle, which was very commonly depicted together in this fashion. And then we have things like cutlery. So you can see on the fork right here, I get it in close enough. Again, you can see the swastika and the eagle. A cutlery set wouldn't necessarily be something that I would expect to find, a country symbol. And then as well, we have a poker set. So entire poker set with the chips and case and everything, which is a little too heavy for me to pick up and show you, but I can show you just one set of the poker chips. And then you can see each individual poker chip has the swastika displayed right there on it too.
So really, this was a symbol that you could find throughout the community, whether it be on office buildings or on forks and knives or on the matchbook for when you go and light a cigarette or a fire. Really, this was a symbol that the Nazis took and perverted its meaning and really forever changed it. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, great. So here we're talking a little bit more about other Nazi symbols. So here we're talking about the SS and the SS bolts and the skull and crossbones. So just a little history, the SS was led by Himmler, one of the top Nazi officials. It was the major paramilitary organization that maintained this police state, this fear, this intense terror of a police state in society. And it included the Gestapo, soldiers in the Waffen-SS, and it also included concentration and death camp guards. The SS bolt symbol is derived from a character in the pre-Roman alphabet associated with the S sound. The Nazis derived many of their symbols, as we've seen, from pre-Roman images for similar reasons that I discussed, regarding the Heil Hitler, this notion, this desire to connect the Aryan race with different empires throughout history. The death's head, which is the symbol of a skull and crossbones, it refers to the image of a skull and crossbones, this one specifically, and in 1934, the SS adopted this specific image as its symbol of the SS. The SS branch that guarded the concentration camps, in fact, even adopted the name the Death's Head Formation, because they wore this symbol on their uniforms. They were known for extreme brutality, and they carried out numerous war crimes during World War II. So this symbol definitely is a direct correlation to these murderous squads. Following the Holocaust, neo-Nazis and other white supremacist groups have resurrected either the skull and crossbones or the SS. In fact, there are hand gestures that are done to signify SS as hate symbols because of these two symbols, their importance to the SS themselves. We've seen recently in public information and media, there was a man 2 weeks ago wearing a sweatshirt with a skull under the phrase Camp Auschwitz, referring to the largest of the death camps that would have fallen under the Death Heads Formation's responsibility, where nearly 1 million Jewish people and over 1.1 million people were murdered. And I think it's really important to understand that these symbols have direct relationship, direct correlation to the horrific brutality of mass violence and genocide.
Yeah, so we can actually look up close at the Death's Head pin that Jordanna was just showing a moment ago on the screen. So that's an example of, I believe it's a hat pin. So it would actually go on the hat of the uniform of the SS. And then we also have a patch with the same symbol. And again, we see the skull and crossbones, but we also see the swastika and the eagle that we mentioned before. And then we also have some images from one of the propaganda books that we talked about before, is actually the Death's Head formation. So you can see the SS soldiers there as well.
And we're about to go to our last image before we can take questions. So everybody please put your questions in the Q&A. We're going to be wrapping this up. I know that this has been a lot of intense information, but I think it's really important to understand why we're talking about it, why this history matters, why is this a conversation that we are having. And before the Nazis came to power in 1933, Europe was home to a long, vibrant, established, diverse Jewish culture. And this is a small map, but basically you can see that Jews lived everywhere from Norway to Ireland to Russia to Italy to North Africa. There was a very large established Jewish culture that was diverse, and Jews lived, for thousands of years throughout Europe. 12 years after the Nazis came to power, by 1945, 6 million European Jews, 2 out of every 3 had been murdered by the Nazis, their allies, and their collaborators. And it's important for us to honor and commemorate and think about those communities, those cultures that were completely lost. Entire families, towns, villages, communities were completely murdered during the Holocaust, leaving gaping holes within society, within culture. 96% of the Greek Jewish community was murdered in the Holocaust, and along with it, a very traditional language that was spoke, Ladino, which is not spoke very readily anymore. So just thinking about what the impact of genocide and mass murder can have, not just on Jewish community and Jewish history, but our entire community and history. Of course, this is a photograph I've included a pre-Holocaust Jewish life. That little girl is my grandmother. This is from before the Holocaust. She was born in France. My grandfather was also a survivor. We do not have any photographs of what his life was like because along with his mother being murdered, all of his possessions were lost as well. And so when we talk about these symbols, you know, there's humanity behind these symbols. These symbols mean something, and they mean hate, and they mean death, and they mean violence, and they mean that people were murdered for just being who they are. And so even if you see in mid-December, I know there was an image that was shared on social media of a man wearing a t-shirt that said 6 MWE, 6 million wasn't enough. This is a not so veiled genocidal intention that the Holocaust didn't murder enough Jewish people. When you see these symbols, think about really, truly what they mean. When you come across these images or words being used, you now understand the hatred, the anti-Semitism, the racist history around them, behind them. Hopefully this challenged you to reflect on contemporary displays of prejudice and discrimination, and why social justice is an imperative, especially today. It is so important for us to show how these symbols are being co-opted and used. Facts are empowering, and by learning about the Holocaust, we can inspire a more humane and dignified world, which is very much the mission of Holocaust Museum LA. So thank you guys so much for joining us today. We are now open for questions. Please put your questions in the chat box, and Christie and I will do our best to answer them. Let me see here. Okay, so okay, I'm wondering, so we have a question here. I'm wondering if there's a point might sell the authenticity of the Nazi Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community, to the German working class by portraying the Soviet classless society as phony and a conspiracy that secretly profits Jews. Yes, so going into a little bit of Jews as both like a capitalist and a communist, there was, for many of you who may or may not have been alive during the Cold War, you remember there was intense fear perpetrated around a communist attack. That did not start after the Holocaust, that actually started before. And so this intense fear of a communist takeover existed. And so for the Nazis to tell German people, you are part of a community that is in danger, and it is in danger of the communists and is in danger of the capitalists. And here's propaganda showing Jewish people as both communists and capitalists, again, perpetuating this notion of fear, anxiety, terror. It was really important for the Nazis to show Jewish people as an enemy, and to further show them as an enemy that, you know, couldn't just convert to Christianity and be accepted into the community, into the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community, that it was really something that could taint and tarnish and ruin the entire society. I also, you know, as I'm going through the questions really quickly, I know, Christie, you didn't have a chance to show us the little booklets. I'm wondering if you have them.
Yeah, I just realized that I totally bypassed at least two of the things I was going to talk about. So apologies for that. Yeah, so I have some actual small booklets that were, I'm going to hold up just 1 second. And this kind of goes to what we were talking about before with respect to the cult of personality that was around Hitler. So these small booklets were actually, they came in a set. So we have a number of them, but I've just got 2 here in front of me. So there's the other one. So you can see, and they were basically these miniature booklets that had illustrations of Hitler in, you know, being depicted in various ways, similar to what we had discussed before. And they were basically called button books, I believe. And they essentially came in sets and were intended to trade or to swap and to share with your friends. So you can obviously see the appeal to young people, similar to like a trading card. And they also came with this string attached to them. So they were intended that, you know, you were given these little booklets and you could wear them with pride around your button on your shirt, or also could be used as a Christmas ornament and hung on your Christmas tree, interestingly. So
I find those so fascinating. The idea that these were collector's items, that one would collect like Pokemon cards or baseball cards. And I noticed you just showed 2 of them there. The first one was titled Hitler and the Youth. And the other one I think was Hitler and His People, and that there was a set that you would collect and hang and trade. And I mean, just the deep levels of this propaganda are still so surprising and shocking to me.
Yeah, and the other one that I forgot to mention is this, down a similar vein, is also so they had these cigarette albums. So this one's actually in quite good condition. I'm not going to open it just because of the way that it's a bit heavy and awkward to hold. But essentially, what it was you would purchase this book. It's essentially an album, and then they had these cards that was similar to the ones that I was holding up before. That you would buy a packet of cigarettes, and you would get one of these images with a packet of cigarettes, and then you would actually glue it into your blank album that was related to, this particular one was related to Hitler. There are other ones that are related to the SS and various different things that the Nazis wanted to promote. And these were really popular with, the youth and younger people, because it's essentially like, again, a collectible thing that you can collect and paste in and have a complete set of. And it was a really exciting new form of media that the Nazis realized very quickly would be useful to them in terms of their propaganda and getting their message out.
The level, I think this is one of the largest collections that we have at the museum, not because it's something that people are searching for, but because the Nazis produced so much material that it just exists. And I know there was a question if we've ever rejected an item from a Holocaust survivor because it didn't meet the museum's evidentiary criteria. I can definitely let Christie talk a little bit more about the scope of our collection and how we receive objects. But typically, if a Holocaust survivor is interested in donating material to us, we automatically want to accept it, whether it be written testimony, oral testimony, even artifacts from before, during, or after the Holocaust that relate to their story and experience. If you've come to previous Inside the Acid Free Box talks, we have shown some artifacts that belong to survivors that actually belong to them after the Holocaust. We still accept them, even though they are not from the time of the Holocaust, but they are related and pertain to a survivor's experience. And so, Christie, what sorts of guidelines do we have when it comes to our collection and accepting different artifacts?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, we essentially have a scope of the time frame and the historical events that our collection kind of revolves around. And as Jordanna said, definitely when it comes to a survivor that has lived through the experience, us as a museum, we really like to tell the history through those individual stories. So it's always, really important to us to be able to do that. And the way we do that is by families or people that survive donating those precious family heirlooms and stories to us to help us to do that. So that is definitely something that we will always, have a conversation about. And it's not necessarily something that we would, I guess, really reject, if that's what the question was. But definitely when it comes to, unfortunately, because as Jordanna mentioned, there was so much stuff that the Nazis produced, we do get a lot of donations with respect to Nazi related items, which unfortunately I have to be a little bit more particular about that. And that we definitely assess on a case by case basis, because, this is our space. We're definitely limited in how much space we have. And we want to obviously reserve that space for the survivors and the people who tell the history and that help us to tell that history in our galleries, in our collection. But then it is also important to be able to have these items and be able to tell the history and through the Nazis and the rise of Nazism, and be able to have the documents to be able to look at that aspect of the history as well. So, a section of our collection is definitely reserved for that too. But we do assess those on a case-by-case basis, because they're very frequent, those kinds of donation requests.
So we have time for one or two more questions. So if you have a last minute question, please submit it. There are some questions that I'm seeing about free speech and displaying Nazi rhetoric. If you are watching from the US, free speech is part of the Constitution. And I would just say that everyone is in charge of their own words and images and actions. And, just because something is free doesn't necessarily mean that it should be done. And just be very aware of hate rhetoric and hate speech, and perhaps the dangers that hate speech and hate rhetoric and hate symbols can lead. And perhaps we try to exercise our freedom to, instead of choosing to do hate rhetoric or hate symbols or hate speech, to do symbols or gestures of love and respect and humanity and dignity And that is what we should be choosing with our freedoms. I'm also seeing questions about recent news about removing Nazi swastika symbols. Actually, there was a whole process after 1945, after the end of World War II, in the removal of Nazi symbols. Just imagining all of the buildings that were built in Nazi Germany that had swastikas on them. There was a huge project, the denazification of Germany, where Allied armies and locals would go through and just remove swastikas off of buildings, remove them from different architectural buildings and other displays that had been set up. And so that was a huge process. If you think about all the Nazi propaganda that was created, it then all needed, of course, to be removed. And that is still going on as well. And I think it's just really important for us to, I know this was a lot of information, but just like consider that words do in fact matter. And the fact that Julia Streicher, the propagandist that we talked about, was held responsible for crimes against humanity at Nuremberg does tell us words have an effect on people. And, you know, as an institution, we believe that this is a human history, and it is a history that shows us human beings doing awful things, horrendous things to one another, but also courageous things for one another, and for us to really think about how we can build a world of mutual respect and dignity by learning about these truths, by learning about this history. So thank you very much for joining us today on this Tuesday evening. Please always, of course, you know, send us an email, let us know if you have thoughts, if you found this informative, this program. Join us next month for our next Inside the Acid-Free Box, which I'm trying to remember. Christy, what is our theme next month?
Charles Millet, I believe.
Oh, so we will be looking at a collection, which is a collection of a Holocaust survivor who was born in Austria and ended up a refugee in Shanghai. It's an incredible collection, the story of him and his mother. Ultimately, they ended up in Australia, which is why I think Christy chose for us to use this as our topic for next month. So if you're interested in hearing the story of survival and resilience and travel and a refugee story, please join us. Of course, you know, go on YouTube, look up Holocaust Museum LA's page. We have tons of different public programs we've put on that are informative, Holocaust survivor talks. Check out our website, HMLA, or holocaustmuseumla.org for additional information and upcoming events. Again, thank you so much for joining us this Tuesday. I hope you guys learned something, are better prepared to speak up, be an upstander, and have a great rest of your Tuesday evening.